The foreman had his hand up before Marcus reached the orange fence, sites closed to visitors. He said it the way men say things they've said 1,000 times. Flat, practiced, final. The kind of sentence that doesn't invite a response because it was never really asking for one. He didn't look up from his clipboard. He was marking something, a box or a number, and Marcus was simply the next obstacle between him and the rest of his morning. You need to turn around. Marcus stopped. He didn't argue. He didn't reach into his jacket. He didn't shift his weight or adjust his collar or do any of the small physical things people do when they're deciding how to push back. He just stood there in his plain gray coat, 6 feet 4 inches of absolute stillness, and waited. The foreman looked up. Whatever he expected to see, it wasn't that. A man that size, that quiet, not backing down but not pushing forward either. Not hostile, not eager, just present in the way a building is present, occupying space without apologizing for it. The foreman's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, which was the move of a man who had learned that proximity solved most problems. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back behind the barrier." 3 workers near the foundation trench had stopped moving. Not dramatically, no one dropped anything, no one pointed. Just the way people stop when something in the air changes frequency, when the ordinary hum of a place goes a half step wrong and the body knows before the mind catches up. Marcus glanced past the foreman toward the skeleton of the building rising 22 stories into the pale morning sky behind him. His eyes moved the way an experienced reader moves through a familiar page, not seeing it for the first time, but checking something. The scaffolding on the north face. The temporary support bracing on the 3rd floor east corner. An angle that didn't sit right. A question forming. Then he looked back at the foreman and said nothing. Nobody on that site was watching the small woman in the yellow hard hat standing 20 feet to the left, her notebook open, her pen very still against the page. That was their first mistake. If this is the kind of story you need right now, subscribe. There are more coming. Marcus Webb had been on construction sites since he was 11 years old. Not visiting, working. His uncle, a man named Gerald who had the hands of someone who had spent 40 years arguing with resistant materials, used to pick Marcus up on Saturday mornings before sunrise. They would eat breakfast sandwiches in the truck. Gerald talking about the week's problems. A subcontractor who couldn't read a level. A materials delivery 3 days late. A foreman on the East Side job who kept changing the sequence without telling anyone. Marcus listened. He didn't always understand, but he listened the way you listen to a language you want to learn, absorbing the rhythm of it before the meaning. By the time he was 13, he could tell the difference between the sound of concrete setting correctly and the sound of something that was going to need to be broken up and done again. By 15, he could read a basic blueprint. Not fluently, but enough. Gerald never pushed him toward it. He just kept picking him up on Saturday mornings, kept talking, and Marcus kept listening, and somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those early hours a direction formed. He borrowed $14,000 at 23 from 3 separate people, 2 of whom he barely knew well enough to ask, and built the first thing that was entirely his own. A 2-unit residential renovation in the east part of the city that came in under budget and 6 days ahead of schedule. The woman who bought the first unit sent him a card 2 years later. She still lived there. He still had the card. He was 51 now. Webb Development Group had broken ground on over 200 projects in 30 years. Small ones in the beginning, renovations, additions, a warehouse conversion that taught him more about structural load than any textbook had. Then larger still. The company had grown by the kind of slow accumulation that doesn't make headlines but makes things. It employed 231 people as of last quarter. Marcus knew the names of most of them. Not because it was policy, because he had always believed that the person handing you a tool is as much a part of what gets built as the person reading the drawings. This building, all 22 stories of it, the glass curtain wall, the mixed-use commercial floors, the underground parking structure that had required 8 months of structural engineering alone, was theirs. His company's. His. He had driven here this morning the same way he drove to every site visit. Alone, in the same navy blue sedan he'd owned for 4 years, parked 2 blocks away and walked. He wore no lanyard. He carried no badge visible. He had on a light blue dress shirt and a gray tie and a long gray coat that was doing exactly what it needed to do in the cold and nothing more. The project manager had texted him at 7:43. On-site walkthrough confirmed, 9 a.m. We'll meet you at the East Gate. It was 8:52. Marcus was always early. He used the extra time to read the site from the outside, the way the facade was coming together, what the street-level relationship looked like from a pedestrian's eye, whether the thing being built matched the thing he'd imagined funding. He had paused at the barrier for a moment before stepping past it, not because he thought he needed permission, but because he was already reading. The scaffolding on the north face had caught his attention first. Then the third-floor east corner, where the temporary support bracing sat at an angle that made him want to ask the structural lead a specific question before the day went further. His right hand, hanging at his side, bore a faint scar along the palm, a thin white line from a cable snap 22 years ago on a site in the warehouse district. He had been loading a materials lift himself that day, not supervising it, because that was how he worked then and still did when he could. The scar had faded nearly to invisible. His hands in general looked like someone who still used them. Which he did. Old habit. Some things you don't let go of because they remind you what the whole enterprise is actually made of. Not drawings, not contracts, not the number at the bottom of a budget sheet. The physical fact of it. The weight of what gets built in your hands. He didn't spend energy on the foreman's expression when the man looked up. He had seen that expression enough times that it had stopped landing as anything other than information, a data point in a familiar set. He filed it and waited to see what came next. Claire Morrow had arrived at the south entrance at 8:35. She came through after a brief exchange with the site safety coordinator, a young woman named Priya who had worked with Claire on 2 previous projects, and now simply waved her through because Claire Morrow walking onto a site she'd designed was not something that required extra ceremony. Claire signed in anyway. She always did, every time, without exception. It was the kind of quiet observance she had practiced across her entire career, the careful, unremarkable habit of someone who understood that small disciplines hold large things in place and that the person who skips the small steps is always, eventually, the person standing in front of a problem they didn't see coming. She was 5'1" on the paperwork. In practice, fractionally less, depending on her footwear, which today was steel-toed work boots with a modest heel she had stopped explaining or apologizing for years ago. Her hard hat was yellow. Not assigned yellow, chosen yellow. She had selected it deliberately on her first major site visit 15 years ago and had never changed. Yellow was easy to find on a busy site. It read immediately against concrete and steel and the particular brown-gray palette of raw construction. Claire's particular form of self-preservation had always been legibility on her own terms. Be seen clearly, or don't be seen at all. Never the blurred middle ground of someone who might be mistaken for something lesser. Her notebook was slim and black, soft cover, about the size of a large paperback. She had gone through hundreds of them across 20 years of practice. The finished ones lined a shelf in her studio in chronological order, each one dated on the spine. She carried the current one in her left hand at all times on a site visit, open, pen moving. Not anxiously. She was not a note-taker in the scattered, performative sense. She wrote with precision and economy, a dimension she wanted to verify against the as-built, a material finish discrepancy on level 4 that the renders hadn't anticipated. The way the morning light was distributing itself across the atrium glass, which she had specified for exactly this angle and wanted to confirm in person, standing in the actual space, before she could honestly tell herself that the thing was working the way she'd intended. Architecture was a long argument with the physical world. The notebook was how Claire kept score. She had designed this building from the first concept sketch to the last hardware specification, not as part of a firm, not as a contributing member of a team where the real decisions happened in someone else's office. She had designed it. The concept, the structural logic, the material palette, the relationship between the public ground floor and the sky bridge on the 14th level that would, when the glazing was complete, Do something with afternoon light that she had been carrying in her head for 11 months before she put it to paper. 3 planning revision cycles. A structural consultant who had told her the cantilever she wanted on the east face was not achievable, and whom she had spent 4 methodical, documented, occasionally exhausting months proving wrong. 2 value engineering conversations that had tried to reduce the atrium glass specification and which she had successfully resisted both times, not with emotion but with data. Long-term maintenance cost projections, thermal performance modeling, the demonstrable effect of natural light on commercial lease rates in comparable buildings. She won both arguments the same way she won every argument, by knowing the material better than the person across the table. The building was not finished. That was why she was here. She needed to see the 3rd floor before the interior wall framing advanced, because there was a relationship between the east face cantilever and the interior column spacing on that level that she wanted to verify with her own eyes before the next phase began. Drawings told you what should be. Site visits told you what was. Claire Morrow did not confuse the two. She had been walking the north perimeter, notebook open, pen moving steadily, when she noticed what was happening at the east gate. She stopped. The pen stilled against the page. She watched the foreman step toward the large man in the gray coat, with the particular posture of someone who had already resolved an outcome before the conversation began, chest first, jaw forward, the body language of authority that had rarely been questioned and had therefore never developed much patience for the process of being questioned. She observed, that was always her first move. Watch the full shape of a thing before you step into it. Understand the geometry of a situation, where the weight is distributed, where the stress points are, what will happen if pressure is applied, and where. The notebook stayed open in her hand. She watched the foreman step closer. She watched the large man in the gray coat remain absolutely still in a way that suggested the stillness was not involuntary. Then she closed the notebook. She always closed the notebook first. It was the signal, to herself, to anyone who knew her well enough to read it, that whatever came next was no longer a matter of record-keeping. It was a matter of something else entirely. Ray Callahan had been a site foreman for 29 years, and he had not gotten there by being wrong about things. He had come up through the work itself, laborer at 17, carpenter's apprentice at 19, lead at 24, supervisor at 28, foreman at 32, not through ambition in any calculating or self-advancing sense, but through a stubborn and genuine relationship with how things were supposed to be done and what happened when they weren't. Ray had seen the consequences of cut corners and skipped protocols and the particular brand of carelessness that comes from people who treat rules as suggestions. He had seen them with his own eyes, more than once, in ways that stayed with you. He carried that knowledge the way you carry a scar. It shaped how he moved without requiring conscious thought. He ran a tight site. His crews respected him, and not in the surface-level way that comes from authority or fear. They respected him because he was first on site every morning and last to leave, because he remembered the names of their kids if they'd ever mentioned them in passing, because he had a way of solving the daily cascade of problems. The supplier who was 2 hours late, the subcontractor who'd misread a specification, the weather that had pushed 3 things back without transferring the stress of it downward. When a laborer on his crew had a family emergency 2 winters ago, Ray quietly covered 2 weeks of the man's costs and never once referred to it again, not to the man himself, not to anyone. It came out anyway, the way these things do. It only made the respect harder. He was 61, silver-haired, broad across the shoulders, with eyes that had spent 3 decades reading distances and angles and the small physical tells that distinguish someone who belongs on a site from someone who doesn't. He was good at his job in the way that only comes from genuinely caring about it for a very long time, and from having paid a long series of small prices to maintain the standards he believed in. The man at the east gate had no lanyard, no badge, nothing on the sign-in board. He was very large, tall in a way that required Ray to adjust his eyeline upward, which was not a sensation he experienced often, and he was dressed wrong for a site visit. No hard hat, no visible safety equipment, a long gray coat that said nothing about affiliation or purpose. He had come through the gate barrier like he intended to keep walking, which was the specific move that Ray had learned over 29 years to stop immediately. He was also unnervingly quiet. Not hostile quiet. Something else. The quiet of someone who had been exactly this still in much harder situations than a conversation at a construction site gate. Settled, maybe. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything and doesn't give anything away and simply exists as a fact of the person, like their height or the color of their eyes. It unsettled Ray slightly, which made him more certain, which made him step forward. Marcus had noticed the woman with the yellow hard hat some minutes before she spoke. Not immediately. He'd been occupied with the Foreman, which had its own kind of reading to it. But his peripheral vision had registered the yellow hat that was standing completely still while everything else on the site moved. And he'd looked over once, briefly, in the way you look at a thing that has interrupted the rhythm of your other attention. She was watching the confrontation, not with the loose, social attention of someone deciding whether to get involved, the particular performance of someone weighing personal cost against moral discomfort. Something more direct than that. She was watching the way someone watches a structure under load, assessing where the stress was concentrating and whether it would hold. He looked back at the Foreman. Then she spoke, and Ray turned, and Marcus watched the man's posture do something small and involuntary. The microsecond recalibration of someone who dismissed something and is now being required to revise that dismissal faster than he'd like. "Excuse me." Her voice was lower than the Foreman expected, calmer than the moment called for, in a way that was more unsettling than if she'd matched its energy. Ray turned fully. He took in the yellow hard hat, the brown jacket, the black notebook tucked under her arm. He made a calculation, quickly, the kind of calculation that happens below conscious thought. He landed somewhere between dismissal and irritation. "Ma'am, this is an active construction, Claire Morrow. No volume, no performance, just the name, delivered like a specification. Morrow Architecture. Architect of record on this project." The words arrived without fanfare. A generator somewhere behind them was running. It kept running. The world did not pause. But something in the immediate geometry of the scene shifted slightly, the way a structure shifts when weight is redistributed, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that the people standing near it can feel. Ray's jaw moved. He looked at her hard hat, her notebook, her boots. He was recalibrating. "I'd still need to see some kind of credential, of course." She reached into the chest pocket of her vest with her right hand, produced a site ID, and held it at a height that required Ray to look down at it. She did not step forward to make it easier for him. She held it exactly where she was and waited. He looked at the card. He looked at her face. He looked at Marcus. "And him, he's with me," she said. Ray's expression did something complicated. He was a man who followed rules for reasons he believed in, and the rules said he needed a name and a signature, and the rules were the rules regardless of who was asking him to set them aside. "I'd still need a name and then call your project manager." She had already shifted her gaze from Ray to the building behind him, evaluating, measuring, doing the thing she had come here to do regardless of what was happening at the gate. "His number is on the board at your site office. Ask him who's expected at the East Gate at 9 o'clock this morning." Ray looked between them. He looked at the very large man who had said almost nothing since this began. He looked at the very small woman who had said very little and meant all of it. He reached for his radio. The project manager's name was Dennis Okafor, and he came through the East Gate at a pace that was technically walking, but was several degrees closer to running than he would have liked. He saw Marcus first. His face did several things in rapid sequence. "Mr. Webb," he said it carefully, the way you say something you've been carrying. "I'm so sorry, I should have called ahead. I got pulled to the mechanical floor. I should have had someone." Ray Callahan had gone completely still beside him. Marcus looked at Dennis and gave a single small nod. Unhurried. Nothing else. Dennis turned to Ray, and his expression was working extremely hard to remain professionally neutral. "Ray, a breath. This is Marcus Webb, Webb Development Group." He said the next part clearly, without softening it, because there was no version of it that was soft. "This is his project." The sentence landed without noise. It landed with weight, which is a different thing entirely. Ray looked at Marcus, the man in the gray coat who had said almost nothing, the man he had told to step back behind the barrier, the man he had pointed at the road, the man whose name was on the contract that employed the general contractor that had hired Ray Callahan to run this site, whose site this was in the oldest and most literal sense, the man to whom every nail and beam and poured concrete floor that Ray had overseen for the past 14 months ultimately belonged. Marcus's expression had not changed. "Mr. Webb," Ray said, a different texture to his voice now, not the voice of authority, something more careful and more human. "You were doing your job," Marcus said. He meant it entirely. The same directness, the same weight, the same absence of performance. "Your site is safer because of you." Ray absorbed this. He looked at Claire, who had opened her notebook again and whose pen was already moving. "Miss Morrow, I owe you the 3rd floor, east corner," she said, still writing. "The temporary support bracing." She looked up. Her eyes were direct and without cruelty, the particular matter-of-factness of someone for whom this landscape, the landscape of being underestimated and then corrected and then apologized to, is simply the terrain they have always moved through, and who have long since decided that the terrain is not the most interesting thing about the journey. "Will you walk us through it before Dennis runs the full overview?" Ray blinked. Yes, absolutely. She was already walking. Marcus fell into step. Not quite beside her. She moved with the specific certainty of someone who knows a space because they made it, and he matched her rhythm rather than setting his own. He positioned himself slightly to her left, between her and the generator bank they were passing. He didn't think about it. It was where the space made sense for him to be. She glanced up at him once. Quick. Assessing. The look she gave things she was trying to record accurately. Neither of them said anything. Dennis followed 3 paces back, already on his phone, already rearranging the morning's schedule around what had just occurred. Ray walked ahead of them both, pointing out the stairway access, his voice steady and professional and carrying the particular quality of a man who has just learned something about himself that he is in the process of deciding what to do with. He had been wrong about the man. He had been wrong about the woman. He was not a person who processed slowly, and he was not a person who avoided the full weight of his own errors. He would carry this one for a while. That was appropriate. That was, in the end, the right response to it. At the base of the scaffold stairway, Claire stopped, looked up at the 3rd floor east corner, and made a notation before she looked at Marcus. "The cantilever on the east face," she said. "When the glazing goes in, the light will do something you won't expect." Marcus looked up at the steel frame, the open gap where the curtain wall hadn't yet been fitted, morning coming through it cold and clean and already doing something with the angle of the structure that the finished building would clarify rather than create. "When?" he said. 6 weeks, maybe 7, depending on the glazing lead time. He nodded slowly, still looking up. The scar on his right palm caught the light for a moment. He was running it forward in his mind. The way the building would read from the street, the way the 14th floor bridge would sit against the sky when it was done, the way the whole long argument of the project would resolve into a finished fact that people would walk past and into and through without knowing the 11 months of drawings it had taken to arrive at the angle of a single window. "Worth the wait," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The careful look, the one that didn't assume. "Yes," she said. She closed the notebook, tucked it under her arm, and started up the stairs. He followed. They parted on the 3rd floor, where the east face was open to the sky and the air smelled of concrete and cold timber and the particular clean emptiness of a structure that hasn't yet been given its walls. Dennis had excused himself to the site office. Ray was below them talking to the structural lead, his voice carrying up through the open frame, professional and focused, doing his job. Marcus stood at the open east face for a long time, looking out over the city. It was the part of a build he never mentioned to anyone, because there was no way to explain it that didn't sound like something else. The way a structure at this stage, skeleton only, open to the sky, communicated something that the finished version wouldn't anymore. The logic of it. The bones of a decision made visible before the skin closed over them. Claire came to stand a few feet away. Notebook open, pen moving on its last annotation of the morning. The sight worked below them, ordinary and purposeful, the sounds of it rising and falling with the wind. "You didn't have to," Marcus said. Not an accusation, not quite gratitude. The simple acknowledgement of a true thing, offered to the air as much as to her. "I know," she said. A pause. The wind moved through the open frame. Somewhere above them, a crew was working the upper floors. The rhythm of it regular and unhurried. "How long on the Sky Bridge?" he asked. She thought for a moment. 8 weeks for the steel, 3 more for the deck. The view from the 14th will be worth it. He looked up toward the 14th, as though he could already see it. Maybe he could. The people who build things develop a particular relationship with not yet, the ability to stand in an unfinished space and inhabit the finished one simultaneously, 1 foot in what is, and 1 foot in what will be. "Good design," he said quietly. She wrote something, didn't respond immediately. Then, without looking up, "Good bones." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She closed the notebook. They stood there for a moment longer in the open frame of what they had each, separately, made possible. One with his hands and his borrowed $14,000 and 30 years of accumulated judgment, one with 11 months of drawings and 4 months of proving an engineer wrong, and a lifetime of people looking past her toward something they thought mattered more. Below them the city moved through its ordinary morning, unconcerned with what had happened at the East Gate, unconcerned with either of them. The building rose around them, indifferent to all of it, doing what buildings do. Standing. Some people move through the world making sure it knows who they are. They announce themselves at every entrance. They wear their credentials on the outside where everyone can read them, and they require that reading to happen before they can proceed. The acknowledgement is the condition. Without it, they are diminished. And then there are people who have learned, through long practice, through a particular kind of patience that is not passive but active, not resignation but choice, that the world's consistent failure to see them clearly has never once changed what they actually are. The structure stands whether or not the stranger at the gate read the blueprints. The work remains whether or not someone checked the badge. The 30 years of built things exist independently of whether any given foreman on any given morning recognized the man in the gray coat as the person who made them possible. Neither of them needed Ray Callahan's understanding to know what they had built. They already knew. And sometimes that is the only thing that was ever really required. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting.